Sorry, Chara. Oh, stop telling. I'm going to stop telling the story now that we're being recorded. um, yeah, but anyway, yeah. So I was in Bogota that one time and had meant to be there last summer to teach this course, and again this year. But of course, we're online, so. We're still a pretty small group. I don't know if we should wait or start. Why don't we wait a couple more minutes? And yeah. So everyone else is fine? Great. Okay. So basically, hi again, everyone. Nice to see you. And I think Diego may pop in a little bit later today. I'm not sure. And I'm not entirely clear. So I taught this seminar last year with Diego, and actually there were some people who didn't feel very comfortable speaking in English, but everybody had, enough comfortability to sort of generally understand what was going on in the lectures, or you can listen to them in Spanish on YouTube, I guess. If people are having kind of challenges with, talking or asking questions or something, I think we should find a way to solve that. But, please communicate with either Diego or with me, or I guess Camilo would be a resource for that as well. So, I teach in Germany. I teach in English to students who are primarily German, and we try and make sure that language isn't a kind of barrier for learning and exploring things together. Okay, well, I really do wish we were together in person. This would be much easier, not least because I hate using PowerPoints in this way. I almost never do this, actually, but apparently that's going to be useful for people. So I'm going to share my screen with you as soon as I can find the share screen. Okay. Okay. So today, so today we're talking for a bit about rural and urban migration, right? So kind of classical narrative of migration. And as I think I said, and all of you were there, as I said in the kind of introductory comments, it is my tendency to try and tell a story in a way which is quite classical, actually, which is to say, these are the kind of existing and dominant narratives. This is where I think they are productive and useful. This is where I think they fail to account for the world we live in. And here's a kind of alternative perspective that we should think about. So to get all philosophical about it, it's obviously a Hegelian perspective, if you want to go back to German classical philosophy type stuff. But quite simply, it's just saying, we know there are problems with the kinds of stories we're told about the world. And that's what I want to explore a bit with you guys today. Are you still seeing me full screen, the PowerPoint? Okay. Okay, then I'm going to work from an actual Word document. Okay, so essentially what I want to do today, I think as you all probably know, even if you have, very little experience thinking about migration, one of the kind of classical narratives of migration is this of rural to urban migration. And it's obviously true to a very large extent. There's absolutely no way that one can get around that. In the global south, rural urban migration has been very closely tied to narratives of slumification or slum formation. So the argument, generally speaking, and in simplest terms, is that as global south economies get tied into world economies, right? People are drawn into marketized forms of labor, which draw them into urban centers where they can find paid work on a different scale. We can talk more about that, and obviously I talk more about that in the lecture below. But this is a kind of classical and perhaps dominant narrative of growth in the global south. And I think it's based on a fundamentally racist assumption, actually, which is that nobody wants to move to the global south except peasants who are moving to the cities in the global south. Whereas, as you all know from, those of you in Bogota, or those of you who have been to Buenos Aires or all sorts of cities across, the continent, there are tons of people moving there from all over the world for all sorts of reasons. So I hope you understand what I mean by the racist underpinnings of that dominant narrative. Anyway, then I sort of move on to a second perspective. This is going to be the problem. I'm sort of supposed to be on the second slide already. Okay, sorry about this. I haven't done a PowerPoint presentation in a while. You can tell I'm kind of I may not seem like it, but I'm actually kind of an old school type guy. Like, I give lectures and, argue this kind of classical way. Anyway, then I'm going to try and develop a different argument, which is to say, essentially, we have these traditional ways of understanding migration and urbanization, and particularly megacity formation in the global south. And what happens when we start to think about urbanization and migration in terms of not continuous processes, but by shock transitions, right? So I'm going to talk to you about mass displacement and urban transformation, and I'm going to do it this session and next session, actually, because actually this is very substantially what I work on. And today we're focusing primarily on India, and we're focusing on the period after 1945. Some of you may know something about India, some of you may know nothing about India, some of you may care or not care. I'm going to try and make it interesting for you by saying the processes that I'm describing, the urban traces that I'm going to try and illuminate, are in fact not universal, but far, far more common than is widely understood, right? So in short, we're going to talk about mass displacement and urban transformation, how this offers new perspectives on slumification in particular, and what traces we can see in the urban built environment. And also then, of course, what the less visible traces are. Okay. So if I understand it correctly, and if people have a question, I can only see 5 of you at a time, so just shout out and I'll answer your question. And if you don't say anything, I'll just assume you're sleeping because this is so boring. Okay. So we all know that migration and mobility are critical for understanding the urban form. And I think Diego talked about this to some extent in his last conversation with you, which sounded very interesting. We know, of course, that migration isn't just about people, first of all. Quite simply, we all know that. We know that capital, ideas, animals, viruses migrate, right? And they affect the people, they transform cities and affect the people who live in those cities in profound ways. So think about, migrant populations in New York. Obviously, they've transformed New York in powerful ways. But what else has transformed New York in powerful ways? The mobilization of new technologies, the movement of finance capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So it's not just humans who migrate. And, as a very basic fact, that's something we need to think about. Even in, even in talking about finance capital and so on, we know that it's not just money that's moving. In the so-called ghost cities of China, which are formed from the pooled savings of extended middle-class families whose money moves even though they stay put, it's intergenerational migration, movement into an imagined future where the family has grown, income is stabilized, and so on and so forth. So migration is absolutely critical to the urban in its material form, its spatiality, demography, political economy, and of course its environment as well. So I teach a class called How Cities Grow, which sounds like a stupid class, but it's an obvious question. And migration is obviously one of the ways that cities grow, and perhaps one of the central ways. Okay, so what are the kinds of migration that we ought to consider? I think generally speaking, the vast majority of the analysis is on overseas and cross-border migration, right? So rural-urban migration is naturally a kind of driver of urbanization, but overseas and cross-border migration receive the vast majority of research and analysis and discussion in the public conversation. And I think a little later I cite a UN development report study which talks about the percentages of research which goes to internal migration versus overseas or cross-border migration. Rural-urban migration is another important part of migration studies. And, I think this is particularly true in the European case, the discussion of the explosion of European cities in the 19th century and the early 20th century, right? So in the late 19th century, Berlin grows by about 180%. Its population essentially triples, is that right? In the period between 1890 and 1918. I don't think there's sort of evidence one way or the other, but one imagines that the rural-urban migration is in the DNA of most cities, if not all, that were founded before 1950. There are some exceptions, of course, imperial cities and so on and so forth, but the vast majority of cities founded before 1950, rural-urban migration would have played a critical role. The rates of growth created circumstances in European and North American cities that are not so different from the logics of urbanization in cities in the global South that we described today. Squatting, temporary structures, creative co-housing, the tendency to sleep in shifts. This was widespread in the industrial and rapidly urbanizing cities like Berlin. I was recently at a conference with some folks from Aarhus in Denmark, and it was super interesting because one of them made the argument that there were no slums in Europe. And this is simply clearly not true, right? Even in the 19th century, when they were calling them things like Mietskaserne in German, or sort of like factory style housing. Even in the 19th century, they were obviously there, but through the 1950s, there were things that one would very clearly classify as a slum. And into the 1960s, a country like Sweden had things that we would now describe as slums. And these were almost entirely made up of populations who had moved from the countryside and couldn't find housing. And were living therefore in situations that we would describe as, untenable, and certainly don't associate with Sweden, right? Yeah. Are we still here, everyone? Everyone okay? I'm going to give you a break. Don't worry, really soon. I'm giving people lots of breaks nowadays, 5-minute breaks and stuff like that. Okay. All right. All right. So what does internal migration look like? What does rural urban migration actually look like in the contemporary world? As per the Economic Survey of India, 2016-17, the interstate labor mobility between the years 2001, 2011, so a period of 10 years, saw roughly 60 million interstate and 80 million inter-district migrants. In India, labor mobility bisects language and cultural barriers, and the economic survey stresses the need for more robust policies in order to secure protections of these migrant workers in their destination regions. I'm happy to give you citations on this if you're interested. Beginning in 1991 with neoliberalization, as one might describe it, beginning in 1991, there was a massive surge in rural urban migration. Mumbai accounted for 2.49 million migrants, labor migrants in that period. Delhi registered 2.1 million migrants in that 20-year period. And Chennai registered about 500,000. So in all of those cases, we're talking about between 12 and 18% of the population of the city, right? According to the Census of India in 2011, there were 454 million migrants based on the place of residence, which was roughly 37% of the population at the time, right? Now, almost all of this was people who were living in the countryside or in underdeveloped regions who'd moved to cities. And yeah, okay. Why is it that people move from the countryside to the city? I think this is, well, I don't know. Does anybody want to answer that? I don't know if it's an obvious question. There have been different answers over time. I mean, people have given different reasons, I suppose.
Well, I believe that it is a matter of opportunities as well. I think that the opportunities that the city brings and that the city provides are very different than those provided in the countryside. You don't get access to the same public services and the same quality of life that you have in the countryside. Given the example of a lot of countries, for example, here in Colombia, there are a lot of the public policy is focused only on cities. A lot of the public resources are focused only on urban spaces, whereas the countryside and rural areas are forgotten. So it might be a way to call for attention and to go to places where you feel like you matter, maybe.
Very interesting. Yeah, Sarai.
Hi, so I agree with Camila, but I think it's important to have in mind what has been happening in Colombia, for example. We don't have only displacement from rural to urban places. because people is looking for opportunities, because we also have had forced displacement, and that's because of the war, and actually because of the not actually war, I wouldn't say that, but I don't know how that's it, like the conflict that we have had, and that's happened in like many countries also. But I think the case in Colombia, it's not only looking for opportunities, it's people being just taken away from their land, and land gives people an attachment to their lives. So I think it goes further than the like only looking for opportunities. It's something forced and something looking it's not people's not looking about. When you work with people that have been victim of the conflict, they usually want to go back to their lands, and they usually want to go back to their farms or their territory, because that attachment is important to them. So land doesn't represent only like where people live, but where people is like form themselves. And when that is taken away from you, I think it's like very hard, and cannot only be seen as just going away from there because you're being forced to leave the place.
Thank you so much. That's such a nice way of describing it. I hope, Sarai, if you'll keep in mind this point you made about returning home, I'd love to keep that in mind for future discussions we're having, whether people do actually want to go home. And that's an interesting conversation to have. It lines up very well with what Camilla was saying. Nicholas.
Yeah, hi. I'm agree what Camilo said. I think that people migrate to the rural to the urban because maybe they can have more opportunities to rise up. I don't know, maybe education, jobs. I think that maybe they are going to have a better lifestyle. I think also because I think that policies are centered in cities, are not focused on rural, because I think that the rural is just for I forgot one word. Wait. Peasant. I think that maybe policies in rural are just focused on peasants.
Peasants, yeah.
Yeah, farmers, well, maybe, and they don't think that maybe a farmer can grow up in a rural, just in the city because it's the focus or maybe the capital. And I think that maybe I have another argument by the line of Sarai, and I think that also people migrate from rural just for violence. I think that maybe Colombia is common. I also think that in Africa continent it's a common migration because the violence, the political groups want to have the hegemony, and I think that for me the most well, I think that for me the most important migration is economy, violence, and maybe because people want peace and want to be safe in a city.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so first of all, if all the participation in the class is going to be this great, then we should just start having a conversation, and I won't give any lectures, because what you have just done is totally amazing, but have outlined, I think, two very, very powerful and perhaps dominant arguments about why people move to cities, right? One is the kind of opportunity distress driven argument, which I'm going to talk about in 1 second. And then, so what Camilo is talking about, people who move not just because of regional disparities between, you know, the countryside and the city in the same area, but the countryside in one place to a city, you know, a first tier city far, far away. This is one key thread. And then the other that is actually very unusual, Sarai, and Nicholas picked up on this as well, is that people move to cities because they're displaced, right? And if you know some of you may know the sociologist of globalization, Saskia Sassen, and she's just written a book talking about some of these themes. And I will say one more thing very quickly before asking if anybody else wants to comment. I actually made this argument last year in the courts, and nobody had any idea what I was talking about. They were like, what? Why would people move because of violence? And I was like, well, what happened in Colombia? Colombia is a country with some of the highest numbers of IDP, internally displaced persons in the world. And nobody, it was like totally not a part of the conversation. So obviously the world is changing very fast, hopefully for the better, but we'll see. Anybody else want to jump in? If people feel powerfully they have an idea, don't wait for me to ask you for a question. You can stop me, and if you're excited about something, stop me and say it, and we'll take a moment, okay? It'll make it slightly less of a fluid lecture, but it's worth it because you guys have great stuff to say. Okay, so precisely to the point that Camilla was making, the new economics of labor migration, or NELM as it's called, argues that distress-driven migration is the dominant form of rural-urban migration, and that this kind of migration led by distress often leads to or enhances urban poverty and the shortage of housing, which ultimately contributes to urban decay. Okay, so keep that phrase in your mind. The problems for migrant workers are, of course, quite dramatic. When they are moving because of distress, they typically lack the resources to finance their migration. That means they have to accept work almost immediately upon arrival, wherever it is they're going to. They don't have any negotiating power or cushion. They don't typically have social networks that can support them, or they often don't have social networks that can support them. And this generates an intensive and competitive environment, which generates downward pressure on wages, creates extremely precarious situations for workers in many cities. And I think we've all seen this. Now, the case of New Delhi, and I'll ask you a question again in a second. So as I mentioned, New Delhi, the capital of India, is a major receiver of interstate migrants, and it's historically discouraged migration through policy making, because after independence, Delhi, once it became the capital of an independent country, Delhi experienced huge migrant flows into the city, which put existing infrastructures under extreme pressure. In this case, the absence of effective public policy to address the needs of low-income migrants, in particular migrant workers moving on a seasonal basis, contributed to terrible living conditions facing that population, right? Now, in this case, you're seeing a bit of what Nicholas is talking about, right? That in this situation, New Delhi, and it's quite common actually around the world, public policy is intentionally invisibilizes seasonal migrant workers, right? And the reason is because the perception is there's some possibility of excluding those people if one creates an untenable situation for those people, right? And this is, it sounds like sort of a not such a great argument. But this is sort of deterrence policy by the absence of planning, right? Anti-planning, one might call it, is widely used and is in fact was at the heart of the last American presidential regime's migration policy, right? It was like make it impossible to migrate, right? That was not, that was in sort of an absence of policy interventions that were intended to act in a certain kind of way. And so it's quite interesting that in some places migrants move from the countryside to the city to experience new opportunities and so on and so forth, at the same time that they are actively invisibilized, right? And there's very interesting work in anthropology on this, which I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested. But it's always made me suspicious when people talk about, you know, what is a public policy best practice, right? And the question is always like, well, what is the intention of public policy, right? You know, because one has to agree on that. Which of you, or did any of you kind of follow in the news this recent COVID crisis for migrants in India? I'm sorry, I haven't been following the chat. Oh. Okay, that's just Diego. We don't have to listen to him. Did anybody see that in the news? In last year, the situation of migrant workers in Indian cities during the COVID crisis. Okay, well, it was absolutely insane. You know, as you saw above, there are some 140 million migrants. Probably 110 million of them are low-income migrants living in Indian cities. Not all of them are seasonal migrant workers or anything, but a large number of them are. And in India, when the lockdown happened for the coronavirus, there was a 4-hour notice before people were told they had to stay in place. But what happened, it turned out that of the 2.3 million migrant workers in New Delhi, in the capital region of the country, that something like 40% of them had anything resembling like a permanent shelter, right? There was no possibility of sheltering in place. So people were literally sheltering in place on the street in encampments, which were then being policed by, the police, I guess, the hygiene police, and they were somehow surviving without work, without pay, without supports, and so on and so forth. So this was an intentional public policy, which became visible only in this quite dramatic situation. And since then has led to a wide array of policy solutions, which are pretty ineffective, frankly, like, building 75,000 housing units in Delhi. 75,000 housing units to house 2.3 million people is a real problem, but that's what happens when you spend, 50 years trying to ignore a policy issue. Okay, so the new economics of labor New economics of labor migration, right? That's it. Has this concept urban decay, right? And urban decay is, I think, a really extraordinary concept, and one that, I hope you'll keep in your mind and maybe we can discuss, because what it suggests is that the city that poor migrant laborers live in is also the city that we live in, right? And that in some ways, the kinds of pressures that migrant workers and other vulnerable populations encounter are constitutive, right? That is, in some ways, they define also our own experiences in the city. And I'll try and show you that using some archival material a little bit later in the talk. Okay. Okay, in about 15 minutes, I think, we're gonna have a little break in like 2 minutes actually to watch Who knows the architect Rem Koolhaas? Well, if you don't, if you do, great. If you don't, he's a superstar architect, and we're gonna watch a short video clip of something he had to say. Okay, so finally we're on to slide 4. Sorry, so slow at this stuff. Okay. I'm gonna leave this on the screen for you all to see for a couple of minutes or a minute or so. Okay, so essentially in the global south, rural-urban migration is typically understood as economic mobility, often seasonal, to mitigate extreme poverty and scarcity of work, right? So it's distress-driven migration, and this is true in most of the models, Zielinski or new economic labor migration or whatever hypothesis, it's very widely understood to be distress-driven. It's often seen as a failure to synchronize economic development, not just between the countryside and cities, right? But between first, second, and third tier cities as well, right? So people don't just move to a city, they move to particular cities, right? I don't know what city there, in Germany, we would make the example, nobody's moving to Cottbus, right? Every country has a city that nobody's moving to because nobody wants to live there, even people who are moving for distress-driven reasons. I assume Colombia has its own version of that city. Okay, again, so there's a kind of failure to synchronize economic development between, not just rural and urban categories, but between regions and so on and so on and so forth. And ultimately, this generates one of the defining perspectives we have on southern cities and megacities in particular, which is slums and slumification. So in much of the literature, it's treated as though slums are the materialization of rural-urban migration, whether that's internal or cross-border, right? So in other words, narratives in the 20th and 21st century about rural-urban migration tend towards this idea of inadequate policy to address those migrants, inadequate resources to integrate those migrants, and therefore as some kind of explanation for the failure of cities in some capacity, right? So now I'm going to, I think the easiest way, honestly, I think the easiest way to do this, would this work for you if I share, here. I'm almost tempted to try and share the actual link with you. Hold on, sorry. I told you this is not really my strong suit. Share screen. Okay. All right, so Rem Koolhaas, as I said, is an extremely famous, like perhaps the most famous architect living now in the world. And he led the urban lab at Harvard for a while. That was one of his things that he did. And, I leave it to you to listen to him. But he went to Lagos, obviously, Nigeria, in order to try and understand a megacity, right? And I'll just leave it to you to listen, okay? Can you see the screen okay? Can you guys see it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, cool. And yeah, here we go. It's quite a beautiful documentary. I'll share the link with you as well. We'll just listen for like 3 or 4 minutes. So.
Abby is soundless. It doesn't have sound.
There should be sound.
No, you should go down and go to share sound. You have to do it on Zoom, because if I'm not wrong, we're listening a mute documentary.
No, it's muted. I can hear it, but
You just have to go to Zoom, to the platform Zoom.
Yeah.
And down on the right side, normally there are 3 dots, 3 little dots.
Okay.
And when you click those dots, it says share sound.
Share screen, share.
Okay,
No.
yeah, where you see share screen, continue to your right, and you will find the 3 dots. It's like a menu that.
Yeah, I don't have it.
Sir, when you press the button of share screen, right in the left down corner, it says share the sound of the computer. You have to click it.
Perfect.
You have to.
Got it. Sorry, guys.
Luego me enseña esa, Camilo, que no supe, pero perfecto, gracias.
All right. Hold on. I have to go back a minute, because okay, basically Rem Koolhaas was like, why are you coming to Nigeria to study, the city? And he said, well, I don't know anything about it, but it seems like an interesting place. And so he said
inventory of a number of cities that will be very important in the future. Pearl River Delta was one of them, because it would leap from 12 million to 36 million in 20 years, according to all the predictions. And Lagos was another one that would leap from 12 to 30, I think also in 20 or 30 years. So that is really the fundamental reason. And then I, of course, became, somewhere in the late 90s, nervous and irritated by the endless idolatry of the market economy. And at that point, it became especially interesting to look at a big city but without any money, or a very poor city, and a city that was at that point almost disconnected from the global system. So the extent to which Lagos was both growing incredibly fast and completely untypical case was very interesting. And it was also for me an enforced encounter with something I really didn't know anything about, Africa, which I was always intrigued by, but I never had felt the kind of closeness that I feel, for instance, for Asia or for America. And so I felt embarrassed that there was this world I didn't understand.
What was your image of Africa?
I guess the image of everyone who has not really been there, a continent in perpetual crisis with health gloom, and economic gloom and political gloom. So I was completely unprepared for the incredible intelligence and the immediacy of the intelligence that I encountered there. So I was really expecting something without any energy and without any thinking.
Was there anything specific about Lagos and about Nigeria that you want to look at that place except for the explosive growth and poverty?
Of all the big cities, it was the least well known, the least known. The fact that at the beginning of the 21st century, within globalization, there could be still a genuinely unknown situation made it very not only challenging but also incredibly inspiring, and of course very risky because there was no established interpretation of it. I guess that was really the main incentive. It's a theoretically very rich country, but where everybody is unbelievably poor, and where I think since the 60s and 70s the average income has gone down systematically. So people are earning less. And there's a horrible statistic that in the early 60s, Nigeria was more important economy than Korea. So at that point they had a shared degree of almost equality. You can either moan about that or find it scandalous, but I think you cannot be there without realizing that potential, without having a sense that when it gets itself organized, it will be unbelievably powerful. And that even without organization, it is already unbelievably powerful.
Okay, you saw that, and I'm curious what people think. I'll share the link. It's actually a pretty cool. It's a pretty cool website because you can see the video either from the air. It's called Wide and Close, so you can either see like visuals from a helicopter or like face-to-face encounters, that kind of thing. One thing I'll tell you is that when he got there, and he and his team got there, they only traveled by helicopter because they were afraid of getting, like, I don't know what they thought would happen to them. But so just so you know. So any thoughts about, if anybody wants to say anything about that? Yeah, Maria.
I find very interesting, when he said that it was a very rich country, but with a lot of potential, but a lot of chaos and disorder. And I find it kind of funny because I've heard the exactly same thing, hear it at Bogota. It's like, yeah, Colombia, it's a great country full of resources, but it's a chaos. And like some of the things he was saying, I felt like he was also describing Bogota. So I find interesting how, I don't know if European or developed megacities have the same description, but from the south, megacities, the description almost fit all of them. And also I read this book by this Nigerian author, probably I'm gonna butcher her name, but Shimidia Ngozi, School Americana, and the main character, it's from Lagos, and she goes to the US, and then after 13, 15 years, she came back, and she has that feeling of how time kind of stopped, but also continue. And it was very interesting how that related with what Sarai said about returning home.
Mm.
And I found when he said like, oh, I felt like it was like the 80s again, like some kind of nostalgia that I feel like migration has very deepened.
Right. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. No, it's a pretty extraordinary intervention. It was a large-scale project, and it was part of a general program within urbanism to look outside of what he calls market economies, to search for new forms of urbanism and to think about different ways that cities could be, and to stop seeing, cities like Lagos only as poor and chaotic and this kind of thing, but to suddenly see them as full of revolutionary possibility or something like that. And I think the intention of Koolhaas is quite nice. I mean, he seems like a nice guy. But let me continue to this text and share my screen again. Thanks, by the way, to Camilo and for helping me share my screen.
You're welcome, sir.
Okay. All right. So, so I think it's absolutely right what Maria says. In global North literature, let's call it that. Let's just call it that for now. Megacities are essentially, they sound as though they're interchangeable with one another, right? Lagos is not Mumbai, is not Kinshasa, is not, whatever, but somehow they all have the same kind of characteristics of being both very, very fast and very, very slow, chaotic, disorganized, lots of extreme poverty, lots of extreme wealth, corruption, and so on and so forth, right? We all have heard this, and it's kind of, it's a dominant metaphor in a global imaginary, right? This is just like what comes to mind when one talks megacity. And very often the historical arguments about how those cities have developed is about migration, rural urban migration, right? And the slum containers where rural urban migrants find and make their homes, right? So it's an argument where you see a kind of very direct set of linkages from migration on the one hand, urban decay on the other hand, slumification, and then megacity formation, right? But two theorists, one a historian, one a geographer, one working on Mumbai, one working on Lagos, ask the question, what is a slum? And how does it actually emerge? How does it come about? So you have on your screen that text from Matthew Gandhi. So he describes a situation which is very, 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 very similar to what Rem Koolhaas is talking about, right? The situation is absolutely, in many cases, terrible in Lagos. Rem Koolhaas describes a city where, as a kind of architect, he describes the kind of poetic freedom of a young boy picking trash to recycle, right? And in some ways, I guess it's nice that he sees it as free and poetic rather than criminal and, something like that, right? But it clearly ignores the fact that the little boy shouldn't be picking trash, right? He should be in school or something like that, presumably, right? It doesn't help to romanticize the megacity. And what we see here in Matthew Gandhi's statement, there are absolutely reasons for the kind of continual downward thrust of wages in Nigeria, right? Which have to do with petro wealth and corruption and so on and so on and so forth. You can see it for yourself here. And that these are the reasons why there has been a kind of catastrophic shortfall in urban infrastructure development over a long period. And indeed, that infrastructural failure, the reason that the traffic doesn't move, that people, don't have access to water and so on and so forth, was that the economy in its colonial phase was planned in order to extract wealth, not to develop livable and buildable cities. And when Nigeria becomes independent, right, what happens? A master plan is created. It would have been financed by petrodollars, right? But the plan was never to build for a city on the scale that that city became, right? Because it was imagined as a national economy where to some extent people remained in place, right? They had reasons to stay home. And those reasons to stay home were profoundly destroyed by first, of course, the oil crisis and so on and so on and so on and so forth. But the point being, there are reasons why the city looks the way it does, and those have nothing to do with rural-urban migration, nor do they have to do with some characteristic of the place itself. I feel like we're about an hour in. Do you guys need a little break? Why don't I just go very quickly through sort of a mini parallel argument about Bombay, and then we'll take a break if that works for you. Okay, so in Bombay, the stories of urbanization are similar to and different from the ones that we know about Lagos. So although Bombay was also a colonial city, and although the British presence led to tremendous outflows of capital that limited infrastructural investment, both as a racialized strategy based on the value of native lives, but also an economic ideology described above as Manchesterism, colonialism does not fully explain why contemporary Mumbai is home to some of the largest and most densely populated slums in the world. And I think it's something crazy, right? Like 210,000 persons per square kilometer, where Berlin's density is something like 4,000 persons a square kilometer, so 50 times or something as dense as Berlin. In Bombay, too, rural-urban migration has a long and nearly continuous history, with villagers moving to the city in search of economic opportunities. There are large spikes in this kind of migration, this rural-urban migration. For example, during the Second World War, when Bombay was a key port for the British Expeditionary Forces and the Indian Colonial Army. And villagers who moved to Bombay found gaps, quote unquote, in the urban spaces that were unpoliced, that weren't surveilled, and they built temporary homes, which sometimes evolved into relatively fixed settlements. Not all of this was directly a function of the territories of colonial capital and the policing of colonial space. Bombay's indigenous economic elite also drew villagers to work in industrial production and so on and so forth. And rural-urban migration in Bombay and many other cities, certainly in South Asia, has also for much of the 20th century been part of a serial or circular migration. So seasonal work to supplement family income. These are some sort of critical features in the development of the city, and are clearly powerful explanatory, measures. I mean, put in simplest terms, I would say what Camilo said earlier is what I've just been talking about. Does that sound about right to everybody? Yeah. Okay, so I think the critical point would be urban-rural migration as a sometimes accelerating, sometimes decelerating process, but a critical driver of urbanization, right? And rural-urban migration as distress-driven or economically incentivized, and more or less well integrated, more or less effectively addressed by public policy. So I think those would be the basic points that we've talked about so far. I'm going to suggest now that we take a few minutes break, and then have some brief breakout room session discussions for a few minutes, and then get back to the thing. Does that work? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Okay, so we're going to take a break until 6:10. So 10 past, oh, I guess you guys, 10 past 11 your time. And then we'll come back and have a brief group discussion and then questions and answers, okay? So I will see you, unless you don't want a break, we can keep talking. I'll stick around. Take a break. I'll see you in 5 minutes. How does it know we started? How does it know we're back?
Yes, Jorge.
I know, Jorge is so diligent. I hope he's not totally bored. Okay, so this will only work if there are actually people in the class. I guess we'll find out in a few minutes. But I wanted to do a little breakout room with, I guess, 19 people here. So yeah, why don't we do 4 people in each breakout room, so 5 rooms. And the first thing to do will be to discuss any confusion or questions that you actually had, not things that things that you are interested in or that we're missing or that you disagree with. So sort of discuss that amongst yourselves. And then I'll post one other question, which is interesting to me, in about 3 or 4 minutes, okay? And if you have questions or confusion that you're discussing, put it in the chat. And that way we can all sort of explore that together. Even if we don't discuss it all today, it'll be a background for our conversation, okay? I'll put the questions in the chat. The first question, yeah, create. 4 times 5 is 20, right? Yeah. No, so 4. Okay, yeah. Perfect. About the conversations you had, and in particular, I wanted to bring you back to talk about the second question, why one should care about this population anyway, assuming one just doesn't care about, everybody. Sarai?
Okay. So I think migrant population is very vulnerable, and in my perspective, this is just so personal. I think that borders usually are very coercive. They have a very coercive role, and they reinforce the vulnerability and exposure to risk of like many migrants. So if I take like the Latin America example, what the laws and the policies have been doing is like to restrict human mobility, and that doesn't translate to immobility. Yeah. So that actually makes like irregularization for people who migrate, and that makes that like very possible trafficking and criminalize people who are already victims of these practices. So that's like in big terms what I think, and it is important to take like to care about migrants because they're a vulnerable population, and it intensifies with many factors, like if you're a woman or if you're a person of color or if you're children. I think that intensifies, and the way to care more about it is, I don't know, I don't really believe in borders. I know it's like important for security and all that, but I really think it's that coercive role, and it just criminalizes people. And yeah, that's what I think.
No, it's a super interesting point, and you know, I to some extent agree with you, and I certainly agree that borders are coercive and entrench vulnerabilities, and at the same time, I understand why borders exist, and so that's the conversation we should definitely be having. I mean, this is like what you're talking about is what I work on, so I'm excited to keep talking about that. Maria.
I believe that we should care about migrants because on the long run, I think they bring more benefits. I mean, if you see mega cities like New York and Chicago and cities like that, they wouldn't be what they are today if they weren't for all the main migrants that came a long time ago. So I see them, or like I believe that people should care about them for all the things they bring with them. And I refer like as migrants to refugees, but also like expats. And I think that we tend to confuse a lot or make like this separation between like type of people that's arriving and which one is desirable or not. But I believe that all of them are desirable on the long run. And just as Sarah said, I believe that borders are coercive and somehow are tending to disappear. So if we are very already adjusted like to this multicultural background, it will be better for us, I believe.
It's a really interesting argument. And, you know, I should say, first of all, that all of the sessions to some extent that I'm teaching are about vulnerable migrants. So people sort of, I'm not doing, you know, elite expats and stuff like that. I'm not doing like you and me, right, in our course. That's not who we're talking about for the most part. Those are very, very powerful arguments. And also, we really need to keep them in mind. The question we have to interrogate, I think, Maria, with what you were saying, is if they didn't have value, right? If they didn't generate economic growth, would they then be less valuable, right? Now, this is, and I was just having this argument with Camilo earlier, this is an argument that's gone back to at least the kind of early 1950s and probably to the 17th century, but actually I focus on the modern times. And it was always an argument about what international law can do and how people are protected. And Hannah Arendt, and I'm going to send you a link, I'll post a Spanish version actually of a chapter of hers from The Origins of Totalitarianism from 1954, which is one of the most famous works of the 20th century, I would think. And the argument that she made is that international law makes promises that need to be enforced. And humanitarian impulses make claims which can't be enforced, right? So how is it then that we appeal to, how is it that we generate the possibility for protections for vulnerable people independent of international law, which continually fails to protect, and independent of humanitarian impulses, which also always fail to protect, right? And this is, her argument is that one needs to grant people the right to be political, that the only right that matters, not your bodily autonomy, not habeas corpus, none of this, right? It is actually the right to participate in the political process. That's what her argument is. I disagree. I actually think that's not quite right. What I suggest is neither international law nor humanitarian impulses nor the right to be political are enough to protect persons, right? What I argue is that it is possible that self-interest might be enough. I mean, you might call this a neoliberal argument on my side. I hope it isn't. But self-interest might be an incentive to protect vulnerable populations. I think what Sarai said is totally right, that people cross borders whether or not there are borders, right? And it just becomes more or less dangerous for them to cross them. And if that's true, then the new economics of labor migration, this point about urban decay, is actually a very, very powerful one. Why should you be interested in protecting vulnerable persons? Because if you don't do it, you live in the same city that they inhabit. And they inhabit the city in ways that are fundamentally destructive for the infrastructure of the city, things like spatial mobility, things like access to, whatever public spaces and so on and so forth. I don't mean that as in there are poor people hanging out in the places that you want to hang out, right? Like if on the university campus, there was this park that you used to go and have lunch with your friends, and then there were poor people there. That's not what I mean. I mean that urban decay in this context is literally that, people who aren't integrated into urban ecologies and metabolisms build homes in ways that are absolutely untenable for a functioning urban ecology, right? That is the infrastructure, the sewer, the public health, the hygiene, the transportation, all of these things, right? That's not why I personally feel like we should protect vulnerable persons, but it seems like a plausible argument given the world we live in for why one might protect vulnerable people, because none of the other arguments have worked as far as I can tell. International law, political mobilization, or humanitarian impulses. So that is, yeah. What do you guys think about this urban decay argument? Did you kind of get it? The point, we're going to talk about it some more in a moment. In fact, it's sort of at the end of the next phase of the discussion, but
well, Andrea and I, we were in the same group, and about the topic,
is he in the same room with you? You just like looked over there.
No, Andrea, she has her camera turned off. It would be very funny if she looked at me, but yeah. And we had a question, and was this topic about urban decay, how, or is it migration always like a condition that leads to this urban decay? It's like, I don't know if I'm expressing myself correctly, but if it's always like a must, like, yeah, here's urban decay, yeah, there is migration and other stuff, but there's like always a constant variable on this scenario.
No, it's definitely not causally related. Migration leads to urban decay. I think it's rather that if there is migration driven by economic need, right? And then there are policy failures to address the migration issue, right? Or even to discourage it through, through ignoring it, being blind to it, or invisibilizing it, as they might say, that you generate durable problems that get built into the urban fabric, right? So not that it has to generate that outcome, but that it is that that a failure to address through policy real and durable challenges will get built into the material fabric of cities in ways that will be very hard to remedy. And that's in fact what happened in Lagos and what happened in Bombay or Mumbai. There were, migration pressures. There was a continual under and disinvestment in infrastructures. First, because of kind of, colonial political economy, and later because of, a variety of reasons, some of which I'll talk about, which have become, extraordinarily difficult to repair, right? Once you break something, it's hard to put it back together. So it's best not to break it, I think is, yeah, I think that's the lesson learned. Okay, now we're done for the day. Lesson learned. Don't break it. Any other questions or comments? That's a great question, by the way, of course. Yeah, Carlos.
Yeah, from my group, we will consider if we take the migration not as a moral fact from building policy publics, moreover, as a matter of development. As you said, the migration shouldn't be taken only as a human mobilization, but as a development in technologies, economies, and other more. And so we were thinking about the policy publics made on these places in the Indian case, and we were told as the permanency of those, if these were useful or not, and as by which view it should be taken up.
Yeah, that's a really challenging question, and I don't have a final good answer on it. I just was the advisor on a thesis where the argument that the student made was that, systemic underinvestment in sort of addressing regional disparities is a historical driver of these kinds of mobilities, right? And that somehow the new smart city strategy in India, so there's the Global 100 Smart Cities, the Rockefeller Foundation Smart Cities Project, but there's an Indian Smart Cities project as well, which is to elevate third and second tier cities to a kind of, not a parity with, but a greater level of equilibrium with first tier cities. I think that that's a great idea, right? Reallocating investment in some ways, or incentivizing new strategies for investing, whether through the private public, or what's it called? Private public. There's a new one, PPPO or something. There's a new public private, something like that. Whatever investment or incentivized strategies one could have, whether those are public or private or some combination of engagement with civil society actors. I think that would be an interesting longer term strategy to address these problems. And yeah, it's obviously expensive and challenging to do though, right? And what we were just saying, once it's broken, it's hard to fix. Whether one can sort of reset the issue is a difficult one. But that's always been the argument about sort of, migration from the global south to the global north, is that if you create economic opportunities in the global south, then people won't move to the global north, you know? And I don't know if that's actually true. And I don't know if it's actually desirable, right? That one would, arrest that kind of mobility. So yeah. I hope that was sort of an answer, Carlos, to a great question. Yeah, Maria.
It's just like a little idea I have about that investment from the global north to the global south in order to create conditions to avoid migration from the global south. And I think it has almost a total opposite effect, as people in the global south will not travel. Like, I believe that migration will be encouraged by this type of investment, as global south see more like opportunities and feel like a level to compete with them, and not like, oh, we're gonna travel as the, I don't know, the babysitter or the au pair programs, which there's nothing wrong with them, but also like, for example, myself, I know I can go there and be better, but also because I have had a lot of opportunities that maybe that investment created here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely that dynamic as well. I mean, I would say this again, I focus more on the most vulnerable migrants. So Maria, sorry, you don't fit into any of those categories. I'm just joking around. But we do know that, for example, the poorest of the poor, there's always this anxiety in North America and in Europe that, the most vulnerable people from like Syria or Guatemala or wherever are coming to their country. And it's obviously not, right? Because the people who are the poorest can't move, right? They're immobilized by poverty. And it takes a lot of money to move, right? And so I think that there is certainly that dimension. Anecdotally, I would say that when I was a kid 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and I would go to India, people would always be very interested in the fact that I lived in America and think that was cool. And now, I mean, I don't live in America anymore, but now the most recent visit I had was from a cousin of mine who lives in Singapore, but still sometimes lives in India. And she came to Chicago where I was living. She said, wow, this is like worse than India because all the wires and people sleeping on the street and stuff like that. So I don't think there's that. I think, presumably economic investment in a sustained way would generate, a desire to also remain home, right? I mean, people love where they're from to some extent, I think, often, like, I know I've talked to Diego. Diego loves Colombia so much. He's always like telling me about some food from somewhere and like this mountain or whatever. I have no idea what he's talking about. And I have family in India that's that way. I have friends in America that are that way. Germans are obviously that way. They tell you about what the difference between this thing and that thing is. It's like, I don't care. I mean, honestly, who cares? But they do. And it's because it's their place, that I think this is a point that either you or somebody else was making earlier about home and returning. Yeah, so I don't know. It's a great question. Nicholas.
Well, I have a question focused on rural and urban migration. And I don't know, well, maybe it's a hypothetical question, but anyone that be the city, the unruly and massive migration from rural to urban, I don't know if this could cause unnecessary problems like homelessness, poverty, or other issues related with that. And having in account the difference in lifestyle, salaries, employees, or jobs between the rural and urban people. I don't want to discriminate anyone. No, it's not like the question focus. I would like to know if the city this migration are going to cause more benefits or maybe cause some issues or troubles with these migrations.
Yeah, I mean, this was, this was the whole impulse of modernist housing projects and modernist public policy from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, right? Was that at its heart, right? It was about transforming, I mean, this was never really said, right? But it was always about transforming peasants into citizens, right? Or people from the country into, metropolitans, right? There was a project in Sweden in the beginning in the 1940s that lasted until the 1970s, and it was to build 1 million houses in a country of a million housing units in a country that is now 11 million people, right? So adding 1 million housing units to the market in urban areas, right? And the goal was what? The goal was to transform a country that was filled with, peasant fishermen and farmers and country dwellers and so on and so forth into modern Swedes, right? This has been a project that is almost continuous since, the beginning of the modern nation state system, right? How do you create citizens? And I think you're absolutely right. There's absolutely, for example, in Indian cities, a tremendous hierarchy between even people who make exactly the same amount of money, who are exactly have the same level of education, and all of these things, whether you're from Delhi or second or third tier city, those distinctions are absolutely true. And it's even more profound for people from cities and the country. So I think that that's totally right. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I mean, I think we actually have to move on a little bit because this whole first part was to suggest, an area of inquiry, which I think is really powerful and really interesting, right? And I think that we all agree that this is in many ways defining of the way, cities look today, right? And what I wanted to do, though, was reset our perspective on a kind of rather different lens. And actually, Sarai, in her first comment, in response either to Camilo or to myself, raised this idea, and I think it's an extraordinarily interesting one. So let's have a look. There we go, Sarai. What do you think? Do you want to co-teach the course with me now? Hold on. All right. All right. So in the rest of am I sharing screen with you still? The PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So in the rest of the talk today, I want to talk about a different kind of migration that I think is actually also interesting and also potentially transformative of the way we think about migration. So I want to argue that mass displacement is one of the little considered but critical drivers of urban transformation. A city like Mumbai or Bombay is defined by refugees in a way that is hardly remarked. Bombay or Delhi or Calcutta or Lahore or Karachi in Pakistan or Hong Kong or Beirut or Athens or Thessaloniki or even Istanbul and perhaps Medellin, I don't know. And Berlin is a refugee city in important ways. And I don't mean a refugee city from the last 15 years. And so in what remains of the talk today, I want to talk about mass displacement as an essential example of how some of the most important cities in the world were defined. Unlike quote unquote voluntary cross-border, rural, urban, or other migrations, mass displacement events set in motion by conflict, natural or manufactured disasters are relatively uncommon. Okay, so cross-border, rural, urban, etc. migrations, these are typical. Mass displacement events are relatively uncommon, but when they do occur, they're seismic in their impacts. So in all of the cities that I mentioned above, and I'll talk a little bit more about all of them later, mass displacement is a hidden dimension of urban transformation. And the fact that these transformations often occurred in the space of weeks and months, not decades, explains something to us about how cities grow. And I think here it's really worth returning to some of the points that were made by, I think, Carlos and Nicolas and Maria about urban decay and urbanization and urban integration and policy, right? What happens when the entire characteristics of a city, its entire demography is transformed in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, something like that, right? Histories of mass displacement are important not just because they shed light on human rights regimes, the administration of extreme precarity, geopolitics, political economy, social movements, or because they can help us to understand and assist vulnerable people in the dangerous business of crossing borders. They're also important because they help us to better understand how cities are transformed by a kind of migration that we often forget about or ignore. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So since 2012, mass displacement events have sent repeated shocks through European migration regimes, and now Americans more recently. Commentators regularly describe the current situation as unprecedented, and to some extent that's true. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, for example, reports that are we on the right side? I'm just checking that I haven't left you guys on the wrong slide. No, we're okay. The UNHCR, for example, reports that in 2017, there were 22.6 million asylum seekers and an additional 40 million IDPs across all regions. In 2015, UNHCR noted that refugees live in camps on average for 17 years. And this figure has been inching upwards as conflicts in Syria and Iraq and displacement in Venezuela persist. The numbers are quite astonishing. And I have to say, first of all, the UNHCR figures 40 million internally displaced persons plus 22 million asylum seekers is incredibly, incredibly low. I mean, we're talking, something like 40 to 50% of actual figures. So just to say that very quickly. Absolute figures are astonishing, but the situation is hardly unprecedented. In the period 1945 to 1952, the number of displaced persons as a proportion of total global population was far higher, reaching 7.6% of the total global population of 2.3 billion. The current figure is about 1%, right? So Central Europe, but in this case, South Asia, around the mid-century, give us some insight into what an actual migration crisis looks like. And I think they actually tell us something quite interesting about how we imagine urban transformation, right? And urban development is relatively continuous, even if they have extremes, and suggest a different way of thinking about urban processes and social processes more generally, that might be useful in a time when, for example, the climate is changing and conflicts are emerging on a different scale. So I think there's a kind of a usefulness to this project, this discussion at a variety of levels. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of what is probably one of the most important events in modern history. It is a history that has almost led to 3 nuclear conflicts, for example, has led to 3 wars, population transfers on a genuinely astonishing scale. And that's Indian partition in August 1947. So first of all, I don't know what you know about India, but the population is incredibly diverse. There are, I think, something like 16 major religious communities, 255 distinct languages, 16,000 dialects, and so on and so forth. But in 1947, as now, the 2 largest populations were Hindus and Muslims. And there were roughly 255 million Hindus and 90 million Muslims. Many of the cities in the country were evenly split between Hindu and Muslim populations, and urban centers were more likely to contain large minorities. Lahore in Pakistan, Delhi, the capital of India, Dhaka in Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh, Amritsar on the border with Pakistan are just a few of the cities with large Hindu and Muslim populations. So, as I think you all know, the British, India was partitioned as part of the Indian independence movement from the British Empire. And one of the things that was quite extraordinary about the British in their effort to administer India was the mobilization of sectarian identity. So, you know, that one's a Muslim, that one's a Hindu, that one's a Sikh, that one's a high caste, that one's a low caste. And this mobilization of political identities was critical in setting the stage for new tensions in this moment of separation. I'm not going to try not to bore you with the sort of basics of the story, but essentially, and I think the critical point is that you know, as the independence movement intensifies across 1946 and 1947, and with the Second World War just over, the tensions between these large religious communities, right, who didn't necessarily see themselves as religious communities at the time, but perhaps were created as such by the situation. The tensions between those 2 communities also intensify. There was a lot of anxiety about physical security, about being a minority population, about other people occupying one's land. There was a lot of heated rhetoric and so on and so forth. And, you know, one of the consequences of this was situations like this in March 1947. So here we have an image of I think this is actually in Rawalpindi in the northeast. And it was a sort of British colonial summer town, summer city, and anxieties about partition and who would be in charge and which city would end up on which side of the border, generated, understandable political anxieties, mobilized extremist voices on both sides, actually all three sides, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh sides. And small conflicts were turned into communal conflicts, were turned into full-scale and systematic violence, which included things like grenades and artillery and so on and so forth. So this is March 1947. At this point in time, before this riot, the intention of the British had been to leave India in 1948, in the summer of 1948. This actually pushed up the timeline by 1 year. So after this riot happened, it was announced that the British would leave entirely in August of 1947, so 5 months later, right? So it's a kind of astonishing story, really. What happened was, you can imagine this kind of story, right? A situation is turning incredibly violent. You're politically responsible and have no sort of advantage anymore in being there. You can only get blamed for the outcome. And so you can decide to try and stay as you ought to, right? From all kind of moral sort of perspectives. Or you can leave and let the people there sort it out on their own. And that might be the better political calculation. And that's what the British did. And so they announced in late March or early April that they would be leaving in 4 months. But there was no boundary line drawn. Where would the two countries be, right? So literally there was no idea whether you would be living in India or Pakistan. Like, okay, imagine Bogota is a city that is, let's just say it's 49% Christian and 51% Jewish. And the country of Colombia is 75% Christian and 25% Jewish. Just imagine that situation, right? And then they decided they were gonna carve up the country of Colombia. And Bogota might be a point which could go on either side of the border. Which side should they put it on, right? I mean, it's an important city and therefore perhaps should go with the majority population. But it's a majority minority city, so perhaps it should go with the break-off nation. I hope you see the point that I'm making. People had no idea where they would be, it was an extraordinary dislocation and tremendous amounts of violence happened. And these were people essentially, in the context of violence, fleeing to security, right? Trying to find home in a place where they would be safe, at least temporarily. Okay. So, I say the second largest migration in the history of the world. The largest is actually the displacement of ethnic Chinese by the Japanese massacres in Nanking, 1943-44. So 90 million people were displaced by that. But in this situation, 12 to 15 million people were displaced in a period of something like 10 months, I would say. 7 million moving in one direction, 5 million moving in the other direction. As many as 1 million were killed in communal violence or during transit. Actually, the numbers rise as high as potentially 2 million. 1 million is a modest reading. Millions were living in makeshift refugee camps. Families were split up, livelihoods destroyed, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so here you can see the map. You can look at it for yourself, but you see the kind of population flows that we're talking about. Rawalpindi is up here in the north. You can see that. That's where the initial violence was. Lahore and Amritsar are both right here, cities that were roughly split 50-50 in terms of Hindu-Muslim populations. And of course, here's the capital, Delhi, which became a kind of epicenter of conflict and a huge destination for migrants. Okay, so we're talking about an intense and very, very rapid transformation of space and population, right? So we're talking about migration flows. First of all, it's very difficult to determine who is a migrant in this situation, right? Because there was no nation state before, right? So people who became Pakistani, people who became Indian, neither was anything before except a British colonial subject, right? I mean, they may have had a nationalist identity or an aspiration, but they had no standing in international law. And migration is fundamentally a fact of law, right? I mean, in some ways, one's residence is determined by, forms of identification, registration, and restrictions on mobility, the kind of border or coercion that Sarai was talking about earlier. So the first thing is, there's a real question about who is a migrant that is raised by this kind of situation of new nation state formation. But what we know is that 12 to 15 million people left the places they lived for other places under threat of violence or with genuine anxiety about their place in their home, whether it's a loss of livelihood or physical security or being a minority population or whatever it might have been. So that's all fine, right? This is another one terrible situation among many terrible situations. But what does it matter that 12 to 15 million people moved in that kind of way at that kind of pace? What did it do to the places that they came from and went to, right? And that's to some extent what I'm making an argument about. Let me first just point to a couple of figures from what became outside of what became independent India. Okay, so at least half of all the persons in Karachi and Lahore in Pakistan, so on the left side of your screen, were refugees. Tensions between locals and refugees over housing were intense, both over evacuee housing and new construction. So the city of Karachi went from 400,000 to 1.3 million people between 1947 and 1953. It went from 60% Hindu to less than 1% in 6 years. Dhaka, all the way to the right of your screen, across the water, the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh, had similar kinds of transformations. And I'm going to show you a picture, a little video about Dhaka at the end of the class, okay? And it'll blow your mind that in 1953, that was a city of 1.3 million, and in 1947 had been 400,000. It'll blow your mind. Okay, Bombay, despite the departure of substantial parts of its Muslim population, grew from 1.4 million in 1947 to 2.3 million in 1950. So we've been talking about Bombay a lot, right? We talked about rural-urban migration, and we talked about, mega cities and this, that, and the other thing, and how, asynchronization of rural and metropolitan economies or regional disparities were drawing people into the city. But honestly, the city grew 80% between 1947 and 1950, and it was because of a massive influx of refugees. And that influx of refugees actually continued consistently through at least the middle 1950s. So when you want to ask, where did the kind of deformation, right, the dysfunction of a city like Mumbai come from? Where was the urban decay? Where was the infrastructural failure? And when did that happen? It happened in the moment when 700,000 people showed up overnight. And well, actually more like 1 million people showed up and 300,000 people left, right? And these are flash moments, I think, which are profoundly transformational for cities. And I think this is not just an interesting case, but a powerful case for thinking about a variety of issues in migration more generally. Okay. The creation of temporary housing in Bombay that became permanent meant that segments of the city were built without adequate infrastructural planning. Entire neighborhoods were built without water, electrical, or sewage connections because they were never meant to be permanent. But with massive displacement, the pace of new construction means that people transform the temporary into permanent homes. The slum of the megacity is regularly tied to mass displacement. And I think somebody was talking about, conflicts in Africa earlier in the context of megacity formation. And I think it's worth thinking about, when those cities were transformed and what other events might have been critical for their transformation. I think if you look for one of these cases close to home, you'll find one, right? And I don't mean just you in Colombia, I mean anywhere around the world. Another example, Calcutta, 1.3 million refugees by 1949. There were 63 squatter colonies in Toliganj, 400 across the city, with major concentrations in the south and east. The appropriation of evacuee property, powerful political interest groups trying to represent refugee interests, these were foundational moments in the formation of that city as what became city of slums, right? Calcutta is famous for being the epitome of the city of slums, made famous by, what's her name? Not Mary Curie, the saint?
Teresa.
Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa.
Oh, yeah. Mother Teresa, exactly, right? I mean, if you wonder why Calcutta became the city of slums, it's because in 1949, there were 1.3 million refugees in a city that had been 2 million. My grandparents used to go dancing in Calcutta when they were younger. I've been told stories. And it was like the place one went to be elegant and fancy and whatever. And it wasn't that 5 years later. I'm not complaining about their dance parties. I'm just saying that these things happen like overnight. You've heard of Chandigarh also, I imagine, the famous Indian capital city designed by Le Corbusier. I think in 1956 it's founded. It was planned as a city of 400,000, right? And it was planned to be a capital city. But the only reason it was going to be a capital city is because the capital city of the province it was in was now in a different country. And 15% of all housing was to be dedicated to refugees. I'll give you one final example. Hold on, I have to look at your faces to see if you're totally bored or what. I can only see like 2 of you anyway, so. You guys okay over there? Yeah? Awesome. I'm super excited about this stuff, as you maybe can tell, because it's like actually the craziest stuff in the world. But okay, one more example. okay, there were 330,000 Muslims, more than, rather, what is it? 330,000 Muslims, or more than 40% of the population of Delhi, left in 1947. Still, its population grew from 800,000 to 1.7 million between 1947 and 1955. And, you know, Delhi was famous as like a Persian city, right? It had been the capital of it was called the Delhi Sultanate, right? Because it was Persian conquerors who had lived there since the 17th century. In the space of 6 months, its entire Persian Muslim heritage was totally erased, and it became a Punjabi city, a totally different kind of political, social, cultural, aesthetic environment. And you would, you know, if you were a casual visitor, you would never know that it ever been that, just, you know, 55 years ago. So the question I would ask is, what does it mean to double the size of a city in the space of a couple of years? What does it mean to do so without any kind of infrastructural resources to manage that situation? What does it mean even if at some point you come up with the resources to house and rehouse populations, right? To integrate them or not. And yeah, I mean, I think it's quite extraordinary. I wanted to show you some amazing stuff from my own archival material, but I don't know if you guys are interested in seeing that or if you want to have a more general conversation. How do we do that? Can somebody chime in, or we take a poll or something like that? I feel like I was like everybody's dad. You know, when your dad starts talking about like like a car or like a horse or like a music that you don't like or whatever. Did I just do that to all of you people?
The difference is that we
Camilla
like
was like,
it.
Camilla was like, yeah, that's what my dad does. He talks
No,
about
the difference is that we like it. We like this kind of topics. When yeah, but you did a very valid example, because sometimes our parents do that kind of things.
So I'm gonna take 2 more minutes to show you something that I think will illustrate the points that I've been making, right? They're all archival documents, and I've shared them with some colleagues of mine, and they were kind of blown away to be seeing this kind of stuff, because can I just ask quickly, how many of you are actually urban people, and how many of you are like migration people? You guys have all studied urban stuff, right? Oh, no? Not really?
Yeah.
No, for example, I studied international relations, but we didn't center on the difference between urban and rural.
This course has urban in the title though, right? I never really looked at it.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll just take a couple of minutes to show you, and I think you'll be interested. And actually, we'll just talk about, I'll convince you why it's interesting, right? How about that? So even if you're not interested when you read it, you will be when I tell you why it's interesting. Can you see this? Okay, so this is the master plan for Delhi, right? So in 1948, there's a sitting, a high-level ministry-level meeting with ministers of state and so on and so forth, right? And they're talking about what to do about the city, right? How is it that we build how do we plan how do we master plan a city? And so this guy here, page where it says page 6, right? This is the Ministry for Rehabilitation. And he says about the old city in Delhi, the Muslim city in Delhi. The worst slums in the world can be seen in the old city. To deal with the problem in the old city, we have to perform some sort of surgery. We should acquire small areas in the crowded mohallas and decongest them. Now, incidentally, mohallas are Muslim, sort of Muslim bizarre settlements. So it's quite a nationalist reading. The chief engineer says, regarding refugee quarters, whether the construction needs to be done either by the government or private agencies would come in conflict with our proper planning. The problem is that we have essentially 400,000 to 500,000 of refugees, and what are we supposed to do with them? I'm just now summarizing. In an emergency like this, we can't wait for a high power commission to create plans. We have to do something. And then the chairman, who's, I'm not quite sure, I can't remember who he is. The chairman writes, the actual residents of Delhi, so the locals in Delhi, claim that everything's going to the migrants and they're forced to rot in the slums as best they can. And here's another, document from the Minister of Health 1 year later. I'm getting more and more perturbed by the refugee situation in Delhi. I'm in charge of the local self-government and also responsible for health. It's difficult to serve Delhi in either of these spheres. Going through the shopping markets of Old Delhi and New Delhi, it appears that there are more and more refugee street vendors building unauthorized construction. There have been illegal encroachments on the part of these refugees to the tune of 5,000 acres. These structures are not always temporary. Indeed, they seem semi or altogether permanent. I understand that a fair percentage of street vendors do not even belong to the refugee population, but of course have taken cover under the plea that they are refugees. Okay. So that might all seem like super boring, right? But first of all, it's not. If you were a historian, you'd be like super excited about that. But second of all, what's really extraordinary is you see in those conversations a situation where people are trying, on the one hand, to create a rational plan for a city, right? It's a new capital city, a city that is projected to expand from 1.5 million to 2.5 million people in a decade. And suddenly, they're absolutely paralyzed by the simple fact of 1 million people who showed up essentially overnight, right? Now, there's some people who one can, and there are other people who one cannot evict, right? You could conceivably just shoot everybody, right? Or you could forcibly expel them all. It's conceivable, right? But how do you clear space that people have occupied and have some reasonable or understandable reason for being there, right? And that's what happens in these cases of catastrophic displacement, or what I'm calling mass displacement. Cities are transformed in ways that are absolutely defining in the span of weeks and months, and it's really, really extraordinary. And so that is kind of basically the point that I wanted to make, but I feel like I should open it up for some questions because, yeah, that wasn't the most powerful closing argument I've ever made, but even I'm pretty tired. I saw Sarai. I feel like Sarai is like we're like mind melded. because you yawned and then I yawned. Now I've like got really sleepy. Okay. Did that make any sense at all, the last point? Not so much. So used to talking to the urban people. Okay, ask questions about it and then I'll explain it more. And I'll regather my energy and then make another argument about it. All right, let me ask you let me put it a different. Say the name of a major European city that you know of, and I'll tell you whether it was transformed by mass displacement. Or rather, you tell me a city that you think may have been transformed by mass displacement.
I don't know, Abby. I have a question about that is related to the difference between rural lives and urban lives. I have had the luck of growing up in a city. However, I've always had connection to the countryside because of my family's country home, and due to the fact that my family is a grower and exporter of flowers here in Antioquia. So I've always had that connection to rural areas, to little towns in the outskirts of Medellin and a little bit farther in Antioquia. And I realized that there's a difference, that there are different dynamics at work in rural areas than in urban areas that might affect not only the quality of life and the development of the lives of rural or urban inhabitants, but it also treats a lot about the way they might behave, maybe the way they see and appreciate the environment, the way their consumption dynamics work. So I just wanted to, that is the case in Colombia. I just wanted to ask if you believe that the difference in the livings in rural areas and urban areas is present in all around the world, and is it really important for is it important and relevant, those kinds of dynamics and difference in dynamics, for urban cities, for example?
Yeah, it's a huge deal. And it's interesting that you say that because, I mean, there's a whole, 2 decades of conversation about to what extent the city is a kind of fiction in the first place, to what extent the city really exists in the context of, suburbanization and sort of mega urban corridors. And, the most recent example of this conversation has been planetary urbanization. The argument being is, what is not urban if, in all the corners of the all the corners of the planet. And yeah, so there is very clearly that people are very interested in that question. I'm sure that, there are people who have more or less contact and encounter with the things that we would describe as metropolitan, right? Like, I don't know, the theater or a club or something like that. I don't know what you think of as metropolitan, maybe a museum or maybe like, a fancy restaurant or something like that. Obviously, there are different levels of encounter with that in some rural places and some urban places, but yeah, there are certainly distinctions, but it is a big kind of thematic question in urban studies. Yeah. I think I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. I actually thought that it was sort of more like a more sort of directly urban focused conversation. But yeah, my bad. Paula writes a little more about the concept of mirrors of destruction. And yes, I'd be happy to do that. And I will put some links to sources. There's actually a book called Mirrors of Destruction by a historian about the Holocaust and then about conflict in the Middle East. That might be interesting in that context. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I mean, I think to sum up a little bit, maybe I got a little too deep into the details. I think to sum up a little bit, there is a kind of general assumption about how urbanization works and why migration is important, right? Migration is important either because it generates problems for the nation state, right? Anxieties about autonomy and sovereignty and identity. That's one possibility. It is important because it is seen as a question of value generation, or anxieties about the loss of jobs and so on and so forth, right? So there's a question of the economic value of migration. I think one critical assumption is that migration, whether within the country or cross-border, has a disproportionate impact on cities. And I think that's certainly true, right? Whether it's cross-border migration or internal migration, migrants tend, in their vast majority, to move to cities, right? So there is there's a fundamental connection between migration and cities. And I think it's not difficult to prove. What is, I think, more difficult to prove is that the basic underlying assumption about how urbanization happens, right, as a function in some ways of migration, creates a perception of urbanization, even when urbanization goes wrong, right? So even in the cities that seem totally dysfunctional, there is a perception that a relatively continuous process is responsible for the nature of that urban development, right? That is to say, there may be a huge influx of refugee populations from, for example, I guess, in Colombia, Venezuela right now, or there may have been a large influx of Syrians and Eritreans to Germany and other parts of Europe. Those may be seen as extreme situations, right? But they're relatively continuous with our general understanding of migration as such, right? People migrating to cities as though through some natural osmotic process, right? That is, this is where people move. I think that there is some basis for that argument, right? There has been, as we all know, a continuous emptying of the countryside and filling of the cities, right? So there's something intuitive about the argument that people move to the country, from the country to the city, and when they cross borders, they move to cities, right? And that is somehow how we should understand urban growth urban development in a powerful way. Why do cities grow? Why do cities get better? Because of migration. This is used to explain both the kind of success of global cities like, say, Singapore or New York or London, and the failure of megacities like Mumbai or Lagos or whatever, right? Both of these, migration plays a central role. What I'm trying to suggest here is actually the reasons that cities become profoundly dysfunctional are very often related not to relatively continuous processes which sort of spike and crest or decline, right? But through genuinely catastrophic ruptures, right? Things that are absolutely discontinuous with the previous history of the place. And that those discontinuities, right? The fact that 1 million people showed up and they had to go somewhere often gets erased from the history of a place, right? So I don't know the history of Lagos well enough to tell you whether Rem Koolhaas is totally wrong, right? But what Rem Koolhaas assumes is that in that country, there was some economic crisis, and then everybody who lived in the countryside who could no longer make a living as a farmer moved to Lagos, and therefore Lagos became a totally dysfunctional megacity of 18 million people or whatever it is, right? That's the basic assumption behind what he's arguing. And as I think one of you said at the beginning, there is this assumption that megacities, I think Maria said it, there is this sort of assumption that what you say about one megacity is true of all megacities, right? And she's totally right. They say exactly the same things about Bombay or Delhi or Calcutta as they do about Lagos, even though those are extraordinarily dissimilar places, right? And we know from the examples that I'm talking about that actually what happened, actually why these cities became infrastructurally untenable, right? The reason that they became the way they are and dysfunctional in the way they are is actually because in a particular moment in their history, it wasn't a continuous process that spiked, it was an explosion that happened, right? It was a genuine catastrophe for the place. It's a different way of reading something like urban decay, right? Urban decay not being a slow process that gets built into the system, but rather something that can happen in a flash, right? In no time at all, and that is almost impossible to repair, right? I think you can tell that I'm quite interested in this argument. And one of the reasons I'm interested in the argument is because obviously, at least in my view, the climate is changing and potentially dramatically, right? And a dramatically changing climate means that people will move in ways that they have not for a long time, right? It seems very likely that, we will once again reach, population flows which hit 10, 12% of global population, right? It seems extremely likely to me. And I think that those are conservative estimates, and there's, you can look at the Columbia Earth Institute's, information on this. There's a lot of, well-supported scientific data, which I'm happy to share with you. And the question is, what happens if that were the case, right? What is it that one needs to understand about urban transformation and urban processes, about the people who are excluded and are, that we fail to integrate effectively, You know, what happens to the places we live in? And I think that this is an incredibly real and live argument. And I think we'll find out whether I'm right or I'm wrong in your lifetime and my lifetime, which is unfortunate, right? Because we're, my view, probably pretty likely to fail to address those vulnerabilities in the way that we've always failed to address those vulnerabilities. So that's why I'm kind of interested in those arguments. Camilo is laughing away, which makes it he's the one guy with his camera on, which makes it a little bit awkward. So yeah, but anyway, I think I would take questions or comments, or we can finish a bit early today if you want. What time is it over there? It's like lunchtime for you guys. Oh, you must be hungry.
Can you give us another example that you were going to ask us to mention a city from Europe that you can probably give us as an example of mass migration? I think it was.
Mass displacement. Yeah, I mean, has anybody been to Athens, for example? Well, if you go to Athens, you will have to wonder why it's such a ridiculous city. It is a city with no discernible planning that I can see. And, there's the ancient city, obviously, the classical city of the Periclean Athens of 5th century before Christ. And then there is the modern city. And the modern city is really just like a horrible city. It's unbelievably like a mess. It's totally a mess. Nothing makes any sense. There's a wall in the middle of a road, and then you have to go around a corner, and then you can't go through that. It's just a total mess. It's totally absurd. And I always wondered why that was the case, and nobody could really tell me. And it was all something about, what people said is that, peasant Greeks moved to the city and then just started building randomly there. And it turns out that's totally not true at all. What happened was that there was a population transfer after the Treaty of Lausanne 1922, where 1.1 million Greeks are expelled from Turkey, what becomes Turkey, and 700,000 Turkish persons are expelled from Greece, right? So cities like Athens and Thessaloniki literally lose like 80% of their population overnight. I mean, Thessaloniki loses like 85% of its Jewish population in like the span of 2 weeks, and the Jews made up something like 40% of Thessaloniki. Athens gains like hundreds of thousands of people. A tiny village is turned into a major city in the span of 2 or 3 years, and it's a catastrophe ever afterwards. These are people who came as, to some extent, refugees, but who were ethnic nationals of the place. And they had limited resources because they'd lost, their resources in the other place. And so they pooled money with families, and, you end up with a plot of land owned by 5 different people who are related somehow, which is fine in the first generation, but by the 5th generation, that's a real problem, right? Because that building is now 6 stories tall. And it's hard, I think it's something you have to look at. But that's just one, just one example. It's really an extraordinary number of cities, and Berlin is obviously one of them, right? And I'm gonna talk a little bit about that tomorrow. But I'll use less numbers. I think I got somehow. I sort of thought you were much more like an urban studies crowd, but now I realize you're more an international relations crowd. Is that right?
Yeah, and also
Got it.
focus on political science as well, and
On what?
on political science.
Okay.
Because in our university, actually in our faculty, we have three main undergraduate programs, which are international relations, urban management and development, and political science and government.
Right. But Diego's in the program of international relations and urban studies. Anyway, doesn't matter. It's not a problem. I will keep that in mind.
I have a question, sir, regarding this mass migration that we're seeing not only here in Colombia, but in other countries from rural areas to urban areas. Do you think that countrywide and thinking about the economy, the development, everything related to the well-being of a country, is it positive that these mass migrations from rural areas to urban areas are occurring? Do you think it's positive and it's going to be manageable for a lot of countries, for example, Colombia, to build public policy to manage cities when mass migrations are happening from rural areas to urban areas? And there's a subsequent question for that. Who is going to manage then the countryside? Who is going to manage agricultural production? And yeah, that is the question that I have regarding to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious answer to the countryside question is the mechanization of, I mean, you don't really need, the reason people don't live in the countryside in a lot of places is you don't actually need people to work the land to harvest from the land, right? So, I mean, the mechanization of agricultural work makes it very clear that, the emptying of the countryside doesn't mean that supply chains that organize, urban resource delivery being like food and fuel and all those basic commodities that one needs to live. That doesn't depend on, labor to any large extent, right? I mean, those are questions of economic transition, not labor per se. The question of whether, cities as such will effectively manage that policy transition, I think, is a totally different one. I mean, it's clear that, we are in the middle, well, we are embedded in a long process of urbanization. This widely cited fact of 50% of the people in the world now live in cities, blah, 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 blah. And that process is accelerating, and so the question of whether they will effectively manage it, really, that's a really, I think, to some extent, a case by case question. And the issue of existing liabilities and existing vulnerabilities and existing deficits, right, in the municipal fabric, municipal governance, the infrastructure, and so on. It's clear those would intensify, right, with growing populations. So to some extent, I think the answer is whether, if you have a municipal government that's working well, it seems likely that they would be more effective than other municipal institutions that were working poorly, So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, thanks. Thanks for that. That was interesting. And I think we'll call it a day for now. And I will see you tomorrow. And we will talk more about something. Yeah, maybe I'll do a different class than I'd planned, but we'll figure something out. Okay. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
You.
you.
Bye.